Part 2, Unraveling the Past, the first pillar of recovery for scapegoat survivors. Do you have the nagging feeling that nothing you do in life is correct? Do you find it hard to experience yourself as good, but all too easy to experience others as good? And are you used to relationships and friendships where you give way more than you receive, yet still worry about being called selfish? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, then you may feel close to an internalized narcissistic parent. And if that sounds like a mouthful or unclear, then I encourage you to check out last week's video, because in it I explain how survivors of a narcissistic parent can feel compelled to stay close to an internalized version of that parent. And this shows up when the scapegoat survivor especially still lives as though the narcissistic parent is around and in charge, or by treating themselves as the parent once did. Well, in today's video, I explain how the first of 3 pillars of recovery can help you break free from this internal attachment. These 3 pillars let you learn that you will not lose everyone you need, nor trigger an unsurvivable attack if you live as though you are in charge and or treat yourself well. The first pillar, called Making Sense of What Happened, helps you build a new frame of reference for what you experienced as a scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent. You can begin to question whether you deserve such abuse or not. You become able to see your parents' problems, not just the problems you were told that you have. Finally, I will point you towards a resource to help you put this pillar into practice in your own life. Well, let me introduce myself and all 3 pillars of recovery. I should also introduce Brizo behind me. She'll lend her calming presence to the video today. My name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to this process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery, where pillar number 1 is making sense of what happened so that you get to know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2 is moving away from narcissistic abusers and towards safe people. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. I think it's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. I've both seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these pillars. And I'd also like to mention that I'm offering a new free ebook called 4 Ways to Heal for Adult Scapegoat Survivors. And in it, I offer 4 strategies that will help you reclaim your authentic self from the fake and painful scapegoat identity, learn and apply the science behind gaining distance from narcissistic abusers, know the secret to reducing social anxiety for scapegoat survivors, and how to accept yourself as the fallible and valuable person you are. You can find the link to the book in the description box below or by clicking here. And lastly, if you find this content helpful, then I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok under @JReedTherapy or Facebook under JReed Psychotherapy. And the links are also in the description box below. The scapegoat child must accept the narcissistic parent's treatment as just the way it is. So in the author David Foster Wallace's commencement speech to Kenyon College in 2005, he told the parable of the old fish swimming by 2 young fish and asking them, "Hey, how's the water?" After the young fish swim by, one turns to the other and asks, "What's water?" Well, the scapegoat child's water involved devaluation, deprivation, and control. The only way for the child to make sense of these cruelties was to assume that they deserved them. Doing this allowed them to establish and maintain a bind to their narcissistic parent. And I'm using the term bind instead of bond purposely. A bind forces 2 people to stick together. A bond is a mutually close relationship that often results from closeness to one another. The scapegoat child binds to their narcissistic parent and concludes that this is how things just have to be. Just as the fish swims unquestioningly in water, so the scapegoat child believes they deserve the parent's mistreatment of them. Believing you deserve to be mistreated leaves you with no basis to challenge your parent's place in your own mind. They are simply treating you the way everyone would treat you if they knew how supposedly wretched you are. The scapegoat child has no other frame of reference from which to know they don't deserve this abuse. The narcissistic parent has a privileged status in the scapegoat child's mind. There are two reasons the scapegoat child cannot question how their narcissistic parent treats them. The first reason has to do with isolation. The scapegoat child, by definition, does not have allies in the family. As such, they have no one to talk with about what is happening and make sense of it in a way where they are not to blame. Attempts to talk to other enabling family members can result in the child feeling even more alienated. They may be told to either stop complaining or that their narcissistic parent really loves them. The second reason that the scapegoat child cannot question the narcissistic parent has to do with the child's cognitive abilities. Up until around the age of 5 years old, children tend to think egocentrically. This means that when good things happen, it is because they deserve them. And when bad things happen, it's also because they deserve them. The young child trying to make sense of how their narcissistic parent is devaluing them has to assume this is happening because they deserve it. The child has not yet developed the cognitive ability to take the other's perspective. As a result, they cannot attribute their parents' mistreatment of them to something about that parent. This would be required for the child to question the narcissistic parent's status in their mind. And all of this results in the scapegoat child giving the narcissistic parent a privileged position in the child's mind. The parent holds the most authority out of the two of them, and the child must orient their feelings, thoughts, and decisions around that parent. The narcissistic parent's ongoing influence in the scapegoat survivor's life. The scapegoat survivor carries the narcissistic parent with them by living as though the narcissistic parent is around and in charge, or by treating oneself as the parent did. In this diagram, you can see how it is necessary for the scapegoat child to stay close to the internalized narcissistic parent. So you can see the child finds a way to stay bound to the narcissistic parent by having to identify with the parent's cast-off worthlessness. This protects the child from losing their parent's willingness to stay connected to them. By extension, the child is protected from being nobody to no one, which you see on the periphery there. The trade-off is that the scapegoat child has to be a bad somebody to a superior someone. Well, let's look at another anonymized case example to illustrate this. Sarah felt bad about herself for as long as she could remember. When she was being raised by her parents, she did not think that there was anything different about her family. She struggled with intense social anxiety at school, despite being well-liked. In her mind, she would go over interactions she had had with her friends and skewer herself for having said or done the wrong thing. At home, she knew to be very careful with what she said around her parents. Her father could start yelling at her at the drop of a hat. Her mother seemed to watch Sarah and report any supposed wrongdoing to her father. Sarah never felt safe in her home and did not think she deserved to feel that way either. She assumed that her parents were only hostile towards her because she was such a bad kid. It was not until she found herself in therapy in her late 20s that she learned she had been mistreated. Sarah was telling her therapist about her worries that she will say or do the wrong thing around people. Her therapist asked, "Do you recall feeling this way when you were young, like around other family members?" Sarah immediately said, "Well, yeah. I was always getting in trouble for speaking disrespectfully to my dad." Her therapist said, "Really? What sort of disrespectful things would you say?" Sarah said, "Well, it was more like my tone of voice. He would tell me that I was speaking to him in a snide and disrespectful tone." Sarah went on to give example after example of the molehills that her father made into mountains as justification for his devaluation and attacks of her. Her therapist eventually said, "Sarah, it sounds like your father had inflated expectations of what he deserved. It also sounds like he hurt you if you did not meet these inflated expectations. And further, it seems like he and your mother treated you as if you were the reason for all of the family's problems. And none of this seems to be an accurate reflection of who you are based on my experience with you. Sarah was blown away. It was so strange to think that things were not what they seemed in her upbringing. This was the first step in what was to be a long but incredibly important journey she was undertaking. How pillar number 1 helped scapegoat survivors build a new frame of reference. The first pillar of recovery is to make sense of what happened in the narcissistic abuse to realize that it was not your fault. This pillar involves learning about pathological narcissism and its effects on other people. It may take the form of watching YouTube videos, reading books, blogs, and/or academic papers. There are 2 features to this pillar. First, redefining the problem. The scapegoat child had to see themselves as the main problem in their lives. They were too needy, lazy, unlikable, etc., to deserve their narcissistic parents' love. Or they were not enough of some trait to deserve that love. As the scapegoat survivor absorbs information about pathological narcissists, they learn how common it is for their children to feel like they are the problem. The scapegoat survivor learns how the narcissistic parent relocates the parent's own sense of worthlessness into the scapegoated child. They begin to make sense of their lifelong feelings of defectiveness as a result of their parents' psychological problems rather than their own. As a result of redefining the problem, the scapegoat survivor begins to question their narcissistic parent's privileged status in their mind. The scapegoat child has been required to see the parent as superior to themselves. Their parent would not recognize them as anything but inferior. If the child didn't do this, then they risked being nobody to no one. The information learned in this pillar makes it much more difficult to see the parent as superior. The survivor grows to see the parent's insistence on their superiority as a product of pathological narcissism. Putting it into practice. Well, in my new course called the Empowerment Blueprint for Adult Scapegoat Survivors, I offer 8 what I call life moves to help you build an environment for yourself today where you feel safe and encouraged to defy the narcissist's rules. The first of these life moves shows you how to redefine the problem in your own life. You get to understand the psychological processes through which the narcissistic parent convinces the scapegoat child that they are defective and undeserving. The assignment in this life move then asks you to apply this understanding in how your narcissistic parent treated you. You will get to separate your real and honorable qualities from the artificially negative qualities your narcissistic parent may have accused you of having. The second feature of this pillar is that it allows you to consider new understandings of then and now. As the scapegoat survivor questions the narcissistic parent's superiority, new understanding becomes available. This is particularly true about the survivor's understanding of their past. Many scapegoat survivors see themselves as being in need of redemption. When they look back at themselves, all they can see is the supposed error of their ways. Similar to the belief that one is defective, this perception makes it very difficult to respect and like who they were in the past, let alone the present. The scapegoat survivor who makes sense of what happened grows to call this understanding of themselves into question. These new understandings point you in the direction of compassion towards yourself. Instead of feeling a shudder of shame when you think of yourself in the past, you grow more curious about the forces that you may have had to contend with that have led to these past choices or actions. And over time, you get to be on your own side as you reflect on yourself. Putting this aspect into practice. The second life move in the same course empowers the course taker to see why and how they have had to see their past selves as being in need of supposed redemption. The assignment for this life move asks you to collect objective information from safe others in your life to challenge the idea that you were defective in the past. This part of the course helps you make sense of what happened where you are not the problem. Thinking about instead of acting from the internalized narcissistic parent. This pillar helps you begin to notice the water you are swimming in. You go from seeing the world through the lens of having to be defective and undeserving to thinking about how you see yourself. So here we have another visual to kind of demonstrate this shift. Some of the figures are a little inspired by Simpsons, I sort of realize now, but nonetheless. But as you can see in this picture, the transition from acting from to thinking about creates space between you and the internalized narcissistic parent. Instead of unquestioningly seeing yourself as defective and undeserving, you begin to see these perceptions as a result of having to be close to someone who had to see you this way because of their own psychological problems. It's a powerful shift that lets you claim more of your real self from the narcissistic parent's claims. And that's meant to be captured here, where the sort of tie to the internalized narcissistic parent in the first visual is kind of operating within the mind. And then over here, it's sort of out of the mind, you could say, or in it in a different way, where it's now in the thought bubbles. The scapegoat survivor is able to think about the relationship to that narcissistic parent in a fundamentally different way than when they are having to act from it. Well, I hope you found today's video useful in describing the process of leaving the relationship to the internalized narcissistic parent. And in the following 2 weeks, I'm going to describe how the second and third pillars accomplish the same thing, all in a kind of collaborative way with one another, that the pillars collaborate with one another. And again, I want to thank everyone for your continued engagement with this channel, the comments and revelations that you share or willing to share with the community here. I think is of such benefit. I hope hopefully not just to you who's making the comment, but I think to many others who get to read them, and really countering the notion of being alone, that I think is one of the just primary features of being a scapegoat and growing up in a narcissistic family. And so I guess from Brizo and I, we'll see you next week. Thanks.